He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't breaking any rules. He was simply trying to get through his day the same way he always did. Quietly, carefully, hoping nothing would go wrong this time. But in a world where the color of his skin could turn an ordinary moment into a battlefield, even the smallest action could become dangerous. And on this particular afternoon, it did. He pulled into the parking lot, searching for a space like everyone else, easing through the rows with patience worn thin by years of being judged before he ever spoke a word. And then he saw it. A disabled spot, empty, marked clearly, reserved for drivers who genuinely needed it. He kept driving, respecting the sign, respecting the rules. But while he waited for another space, he watched something unfold that sent a cold ripple through his chest. A luxury SUV slid into that same disabled spot, like it was nothing more than an open invitation. No placard, no permission, no hesitation. And stepping out wasn't someone confused or unaware. It was Karen, a woman who moved like the world owed her space, owed her silence, owed her whatever she demanded. She didn't look at the sign. She didn't look at him. She didn't even bother pretending she cared. And in that moment, standing there with his disability clearly visible, he felt the sting he knew all too well, the kind that wasn't spoken but felt in the way people like Karen dismissed him, ignored him, acted as if his needs were optional while hers were mandatory. It wasn't just entitlement. It was something deeper, something sharper, something that had followed him his entire life. He knew what would happen if he parked there. He knew the assumptions, the accusations, the judgment waiting the second he opened his door. But Karen? She walked away untouched, unbothered, unquestioned. At least, that's what she thought. Because what she didn't see, what she never imagined, was that someone else had watched everything. And what happened next would send shockwaves across the internet, exposing a truth far bigger than a parking violation, a truth about privilege, a truth about consequences, a truth about the moment one officer decided he wasn't going to let this slide. What came after would change everything, but if he had known how far this would spiral, he might have looked away. He didn't. And that's why you're hearing this story now. And trust me, the moment the officer stepped into that parking lot, the real story began. IT was supposed to be just another Saturday for him, a quiet afternoon marked by routine, the kind he relied on to keep life steady. He had driven to the shopping center like he'd done countless times before, moving carefully through crowded lanes, scanning for a space that wouldn't strain the limits of his already challenged mobility. This lot, this place, had become familiar to him, predictable, safe enough. Most days, people barely noticed him. He was used to that, being the man others looked past, the man whose wheelchair drew sympathy from some, impatience from others, and a painful kind of silence from those who didn't know what to say. But he'd learned to move through the world quietly, carrying the weight of assumptions others made long before he ever opened his mouth. Still, he managed. Still, he held on to his dignity. He had errands to run, nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. A grocery stop, a quick pharmacy pickup, maybe a snack from the bakery. He liked if the line wasn't too long. His life wasn't glamorous, but it was his, and he guarded the small pieces of independence he had left. As he circled the lot, he spotted a disabled space opening up. He waited patiently, watching the car back out, preparing to move forward. But in seconds, everything shifted. A white SUV appeared out of nowhere, sliding into the spot with a kind of boldness that had nothing to do with ignorance and everything to do with entitlement. He froze, not because of the act itself, but because of what it represented. A reminder he never asked for. A reminder he could never escape. He'd seen people bend rules before, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just a stolen parking spot. It was the look Karen gave the world as she stepped out, unapologetic, untouchable, and completely certain she'd get away with it. And in that instant, something in the air changed. Because what he didn't know was that someone else had been watching too, and their reaction would set off a chain of events no one in that parking lot was prepared for. The moment Karen walked away from the stolen disabled spot, the atmosphere in the parking lot shifted, subtle at first, like a breeze right before a storm. He watched her disappear into the crowd, her steps light and careless, her posture dripping with a confidence he had never been allowed to carry. He tried to shake it off, tried to refocus on finding another spot, but the sting lingered. It always did. He maneuvered toward the far end of the lot, where the only remaining spaces usually hid. Every push of his wheels reminded him of what that spot represented. Access, safety, a small measure of dignity. Things he had to fight for. Things some people felt entitled to take without thinking twice. And as he found a distant space and positioned his chair, he noticed people whispering, glancing back toward Karen's SUV. Phones were out. Eyes were narrowed. Something was brewing. He tried to mind his business. It wasn't the first time he'd watched someone misuse a disabled space. It wouldn't be the last. But today, there was something about the way she looked straight through him, as if he were invisible, that sat heavier than usual. Minutes passed. He adjusted in his chair, preparing to head toward the store, when the unmistakable black and white shape of a patrol vehicle rolled into view. It didn't speed. It didn't rush. It moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who knew they were about to step into something important. When the officer stepped out, he scanned the lot, and within seconds his gaze locked on the empty driver's seat of Karen's SUV sitting boldly in the blue-striped space. The officer's expression tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from seeing a violation far too often and knowing who usually pays the price for it. The officer didn't look around to see if anyone had a disability placard. He didn't try to rationalize it. He knew what he was seeing, and he went straight to work. The crowd followed his every move as he inspected the plate, checked the windshield, and circled the SUV like he was gathering evidence at a crime scene. Each scribble of his pen carved a deeper sense of justice into the moment. Justice the man in the wheelchair had long been denied. He stayed quiet, just watching. But inside, a battle raged. Part of him felt vindicated. Finally, someone was paying attention. Another part felt uneasy, knowing how quickly situations like this could turn hostile, depending on who the offender was and who the victim wasn't. He watched the officer slide the bright yellow ticket under the wiper, and then, like a cue from the universe itself, Karen strutted out of the store, bag swinging, coffee in hand, oblivious to the gathering storm. She didn't see the ticket at first. She saw the officer, and then she saw him. Her expression snapped from confusion to outrage in a heartbeat. Her face twisted as if she were the one truly wronged. She marched forward, her steps sharp and furious, her entitlement radiating like heat from pavement. People braced themselves. They'd seen this movie before. She threw her hands up, her gestures dramatic and wild, her face red with indignation. Even without hearing her words, the message was clear. She was furious, and she was trying to make herself the victim. But the officer didn't react. He didn't flinch. He simply pointed, first at the sign, then at the paint beneath her SUV, and finally, with calm, unwavering clarity at him. The crowd murmured. Eyes widened. The tension thickened, settling into the air like smoke. Karen's expression changed, not to remorse, but to something colder, sharper. Her gaze cut toward him with a kind of resentment he recognized too well. The resentment of someone who believed their convenience mattered more than his right to exist comfortably in a world built without him in mind. Her voice rose, louder and louder, her tone dripping with disbelief that anyone, especially someone like him, had the nerve to stand as a silent witness. She gestured toward him in a way that made his stomach tighten, a way that carried the unspoken suggestion that he didn't belong in the conversation unless she allowed it. And then the officer did something no one expected. He reached for his radio. The crowd leaned in. Karen froze. Within moments, the rumble of a tow truck echoed to the lot, rolling into view with a kind of intimidating presence that made even the boldest offenders rethink their choices. Karen didn't rethink anything. She panicked. Her frustration turned frantic as she circled the officer, then the truck, pointing at him again as if his existence had caused all of this. The bystanders watched, some stunned, some recording, others whispering about how fast entitlement turns to rage when consequences show up wearing a badge. For him, the moment was heavy, not triumphant, not joyful, just heavy, because this wasn't just about a parking space. It was about being seen, about being acknowledged, about someone finally saying, "You matter here." But what Karen did next would push the entire situation to a level no one in that parking lot expected. Because the moment the tow truck hooked her SUV off the ground, Her reaction ignited something that would turn a simple parking violation into a national spectacle and drag him into the center of a storm he never asked for. He didn't notice the crowd at first. All he could see were the two officers closing in on him. Steps heavy, hands already hovering near their belts, eyes filled with the kind of suspicion that didn't need words. The humid evening air felt tighter, heavier, as if the whole street had narrowed into a single point aimed straight at him. Face the wall. Now! The command cracked like lightning. His knees trembled. His breath stuttered. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open, fingers spread. Each movement measured like he was defusing a bomb strapped to his own chest. I didn't do anything, he said, but his voice barely carried. It didn't matter. They weren't listening. One officer grabbed his arm. Hard enough to bruise. Hard enough to show this wasn't about questioning. It was about control. The other officer stepped behind him, pressing a forearm against his back, pushing him toward the brick wall. The bricks felt cold, rough, almost mocking against his skin. He could hear people now. Whispers, gasps, phones sliding out of pockets. A few voices saying, "Hey, he didn't do anything." But the officers didn't flinch. Stop resisting. The words slammed into him like a punch. He wasn't resisting. He was barely breathing. But he had heard that phrase too many times before. He knew what it meant. He knew how it was used. A surge of panic shot through him, making his heart pound so violently he thought it might crack a rib. He felt the officer's grip shift, the tension in the man's arm, the unspoken threat in the air. Then the click, metal scraping against the officer's holster. For a second, the world blurred. He didn't know if the officer was reaching for cuffs or a gun. His vision tunneled. His knees weakened. His entire life flashed in fragments. His mother's laugh, his little brother's face, the promise he made himself to stay out of trouble, even when trouble kept finding people who looked like him. Please, he managed. Just one word. Barely a whisper. It didn't slow them down. One officer yanked his wrist behind his back, twisting it until pain exploded up his arm. The other kept shouting, kept accusing, kept escalating as if volume alone could rewrite reality. Someone in the crowd screamed, "I'm recording! Don't touch him." For the first time, something shifted. A moment of hesitation. A flicker of uncertainty in the officer's eyes. Sirens wailed in the distance. Another unit responding to the scene. The sound cut through the chaos like a blade. More officers. More pressure. More chances for this to go wrong. His chest tightened as the officer's grip grew even more forceful. He could feel the blood pulsing in his ears, drowning out the crowd. He wondered if this was the moment everyone talked about, the moment families mourned, the moment hashtags were born from. He wondered if he'd survive long enough to tell the truth. Then the officer's hand froze mid-movement. Someone new had arrived. Someone with a voice that sliced through everything. "Get your hands off him, now." For a split second, the entire street went silent, and in that razor-thin pause, everything was about to change. When the commanding voice cut through the chaos, the officer's hand hesitated just long enough for the tension in his chest to loosen, though only slightly. The superior officer stepped forward, assessing the scene with sharp, controlled gaze that revealed exactly how wrong things had already gone. The crowd pressing closer, phones raised higher, breaths held tighter. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt the smallest crack of light breaking through the fear. "Uncuff him," the superior ordered. The grip on his wrist loosened, but the ache lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. A reminder of how quickly control can be stolen and how slowly dignity returns. One officer muttered something under his breath, defensive, rehearsed, the kind of justification polished by years of never being questioned. The other stepped back as if distancing himself could undo what he'd done. He turned around slowly, rubbing his sore wrists, grounding himself in the presence of crowd. Some faces looked furious, others frightened, but most carried the same expression. Exhaustion. Exhaustion from witnessing something they had seen far too many times. Something they wished they could forget, but knew they couldn't. A woman approached him first, asking quietly if he was okay. He nodded, though the truth was far more complicated. Being okay didn't mean unharmed. Being okay didn't mean safe. Being okay didn't erase what happened. The superior officer, after dispersing the crowd and pulling the two officers aside, returned to him with a careful, measured expression. "I'm sorry about what happened. This shouldn't have escalated like that." The words sounded genuine, but they also felt painfully inadequate, like patching a deep wound with a thin strip of tape. He didn't lash out. He didn't yell. He didn't crumble. He just stood there, breathing slowly, trying to stitch together the pieces of himself that had been shaken loose. He answered a few questions, provided his information, and accepted the offer to file an official report. But the entire time, one thought kept looping through his mind. This could have ended differently. This could have ended differently. This could have ended the way too many stories do, with a name on a headline and a vigil on the sidewalk. When the officers finally drove away and the crowd thinned, he found himself standing alone on the same street, where everything had nearly gone so wrong. It looked ordinary again, almost peaceful, but he wasn't the same. Something had shifted inside him, something heavy yet sharpened. Fear mixed with clarity, anger intertwined with purpose. That night, when he got home, his hands were still trembling. His family's relief came in waves. First intense concern, then anger, then an overwhelming need to hold him, to remind him he was still here. But as he sat down, replaying the moment the officer's hand hovered near his holster, he realized the impact stretched far beyond himself. The story wasn't just IT belonged to a long, unbroken line of people who looked like him. People who had been stopped, questioned, cuffed, thrown, silenced, and mistaken. Over and over again he told his family everything, not to scare them, but because silence only protects those who cause a harm. He posted his story online, and within hours, messages flooded in, some from strangers offering support, others sharing their own experiences. Hundreds of comments echoed the same sentiment. "This happens too often. This could have been me. We're tired." And yet, through all the noise, one message stood out. It came from a younger boy, maybe 16, who wrote, "Thank you for telling this. I've been scared to walk alone at night. Hearing your story made me feel less alone, but it also made me realize we need to speak up if anything's going to change." That hit him harder than the officer's hands ever could, because that was the impact, raw, real, and impossible to ignore. His story had become another thread in a larger movement, one built on truth-telling, lived experiences, and a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, is listening that he survived the night, but the memory would stay with him, etched into his bones, shaping how he moved through the world, how he looked over his shoulder, how he breathed when a patrol car passed too slowly. And he wasn't alone. Millions carry that same memory, that same tension, that same unspoken question. How many more times will this happen before something truly changes? The ending of his story isn't victory. It's a reminder, a warning, a call. Because the real question, the one we all need to ask ourselves, is this